Yeah. Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Wayne Ulrich. I'm based in the Philippines. I'm the senior advisor for risk reduction and resilience here in the country, and my job is to integrate components of resilience and risk management into our strategy, and to ensure that our programs are evidence-driven um, and doing some good for the population. And we do that through measuring resilience or looking at adaptive programming in our work. So today I'm going to talk to you about climate change and risk reduction and how it relates to child protection in emergencies. Okay, I'm going to move a slide. Next slide, here we go. Okay, we will cover a number of things. We will look at what is disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. I will use DRR and CCA through the course of this discussion. We'll look at vulnerability. We'll introduce a little bit of, kind of how does DRR and climate change interact with each other, and we'll finish with some guiding principles on how we can integrate adaptation into risk reduction. And then you'll be given an assignment which we'll be looking forward to what you produce. Climate change, there's a big debate going on at the moment about whether it actually exists or whether it doesn't. But I, for one, am convinced it is happening, and so are many other thousands of people. There's a lot of reports, there's a lot of information which proves without question that climate change has been happening for centuries, but in the recent decades, we've seen a rapid increase in climate change, mainly because of human activities. This has influenced the greenhouse gases, and essentially there's been a build-up of these gases, and we see a lot more impact of this rapid change in climate than we have seen in the past. Okay, if we look at kind of trying to understand about the greenhouse effect, basically what happens is if it's like putting a blanket around yourself. If the blanket is thick, you get hotter. If it's a thin sheet, it's not so hot. So basically the same principle applies. The sun hits the earth, the heat radiates off the earth, and goes back into the atmosphere. But the more blanket or the more gases that we put into the air, it basically shields the sun rays from being released away from the earth, and therefore you get increased temperature. A very simple way of thinking about it. There's a lot more to it, but we'll just stay with that for now. The changes in the temperature is very small. It's very small percentages, but the problem of changing temperature or rapid change of climate is the rate of the change. We see this happening a lot more quicker now than in the past, and a small change across the globe has major consequences on everything else, and we'll touch on that in a minute. So in regards to risk or disaster risk reduction, climate events or the change in climate, has produced a lot more severe, what would you say, incidences or calamities or disasters than we've seen in the past. We don't often see more frequent ones. here I do say in some places we see the frequency increased, but in most places the severity or the size of the disaster is bigger because of this kind of concentration of climate-related hazards, and we'll touch on those in a minute. And these have, of course, significant implications on sustainable development. For example, as there are less rains in Central Africa, people have to resort to other types of livelihood techniques, or they have to migrate, they have to move around a lot more than what they used to. We see a lot more indication of poverty with the stresses on rural farmers, with kind of the stresses on political agendas and budgets, and we see an increase in migration. And this, of course, leads to increased vulnerability and stresses. If any of you have any questions as we go along, just stick your hand up or type something and I'll be happy to touch on it. The point of this presentation today is basically going to talk about climate change, how it actually makes disaster risk reduction even more important for us to be dealing with. But it's not just about climate, and we'll be touching on some other aspects of DRR as we go along. When we say disaster risk, there's many different definitions. What I am presenting to you today is not any one specific agency definition. It is focusing more on the UNISDR definitions, and I've in some places tried to combine different kind of understandings or techniques applied by different agencies, from CARE to the Red Cross to Save the Children, as a way to try to accommodate everybody's way of thinking. So if you are working with Save the Children or you're working with CARE, there may be slight differences in the interpretations, but bottom line, we're all saying very much the same thing. That disaster risk is very much about the potential for losses because of disasters over a specific period of time. Disaster risk, by definition, is a risk related to disaster, or how does a disaster increase risk. It is not so much about a development agenda. If we look at development, we look more at risk reduction. When we talk about humanitarian, we look a lot more at disaster risk. So in this case, we are focusing on the disasters and their negative consequences that they have on people and on livelihoods. There are 5 different types of hazards. Those entering this discussion maybe early on for the first time, we won't be so much using the word natural disaster, because I for one don't believe there is such a thing as a natural disaster. There's nothing natural about disaster. It is actually natural hazards or human-induced hazards that create disasters. And in this case, when we look at natural hazards, we talk about things like earthquakes, cyclones, flooding, droughts, epidemics, and so on and so forth. And these, when they are, like, what would you say, flooding, when flooding is controlled, it may not be a disaster, but it is a hazard. When there is extreme temperatures in some places, you'll find that it has very severe consequences. In other places, maybe not. Extreme temperature in the desert may not make a difference at all. Extreme temperature in Europe would, of course, create all kinds of issues. So with the exception of the geophysical or the earthquakes and the volcanoes, all of these hazards are directly or indirectly affected by climate, storms, flooding, etc. There is impact, and there is kind of a relationship between climate and these hazards. When we talk about a disaster, when the hazard becomes very big, or the intensity of the hazard becomes very big. We call it the strength. Like a typhoon, you'll rate the strength of a typhoon by category 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The length will be the time that it occurs. The tsunami that happened in Aceh occurred on a Sunday morning. And a lot of people were, all of the men were out in the field, women and children were in their houses. So the impact of the typhoon in Aceh, you saw a lot of more women and children being killed in many ways because of the time. The size, well, we can compare different sizes of typhoons or different sizes of earthquakes depending on the magnitude, for example, and the density. If there is a flood, let's say in the Sahara Desert, without the population, it probably is not a disaster. But if there is a flood in the middle of Manila, with the high concentration of population, you are going to see a larger scale of impact. And in the case of Philippines, for example, for warning, you usually have 2 to 7 days warning before a typhoon hits. So there's quite a lot you can do to prepare for the disaster to come before it comes. Oh, okay, we're getting a lot more people joining. Welcome to the discussion. Disaster risk reduction, again, for many, there is a very complicated or a very detailed explanation about what disaster risk reduction is, but all you guys need to remember is disaster risk reduction is things that we do to reduce the hazard from becoming a big disaster. Like it's things we can do to reduce vulnerability. It's things we can do to improve capacities, for example, and also improve the way that people are prepared. So disaster risk reduction is about doing things that will reduce the potential of hazards or events from becoming a disaster, or reducing the impact of a hazard when it causes a disaster. Yeah. So if you remember this middle line, DRR reduces exposure to hazards and events, reduce vulnerability, improve preparedness. That's the easy way of interpreting what DRR is all about. It's about the disaster, and it's about reducing risk to that disaster. And there is a simple equation. Some people, this is the most common. It's R for risk equals hazard times vulnerability over capacity. Some people put exposure in there as well in the equation, but we're going to focus on this kind of calculation in this discussion because it's the most simple, and vulnerability often is also linked with exposure. So if you're good with mathematics and you want to reverse or to reduce the R, reduce the risk, you would reduce the hazard, for example. So if the hazard is smaller, and then you have the same vulnerability capacity, the risk will be also smaller. If you reduce the vulnerability, then the risk is going to be less. If you increase the capacity, you're going to reduce the risk. So if you can do all three, if you can reduce the hazard, reduce the vulnerability, increase the capacity, then we're going to be reducing the risk. But in some cases, we cannot reduce the hazard, for example, like an earthquake or a typhoon. So in our work, in the different organizations, we focus primarily on vulnerability and capacity. What are we doing to reduce the vulnerability? What are we doing to build the capacity in order for people to be less vulnerable to hazards or disasters, or alternatively build their resilience towards the potential risks and hazards that they may be facing. DRR, if you look at the whole inclusive part of DRR, it includes these areas. It's what do we do to help prevent. We can't prevent earthquakes. We can't prevent typhoons, but we might be able to prevent a flood by building a wall, or we may be able to remove people away. We can mitigate, we can reduce the impact of the hazard by perhaps improving drainage systems for rainwater. And we can spend a lot of time looking at preparedness. And these are actions that will enhance or build the capacity of people um, to be to respond to the disaster when it happens. Can I just every one of you, can you just say okay if you can hear me well, so I can see that you are paying attention and you're not out for coffee? Just say okay. Yeah, okay, great. We got a few people. Okay, let it roll. We got to make sure that we're all kind of together on this. This is quite a simple presentation for most of us. I've tried to keep it simple. I prefer, I prefer. Okay, you can have, all of you can have a coffee. Go out and have a coffee. It's all right. Just put your speakers up. I prefer PowerPoints with a lot of pictures, but unfortunately, this system I was told to keep the pictures to a minimum, and so now we have a lot of words on each slide, and we'll maybe talk about that a little bit later on. But if we look at the cycle, let's go back to the slides. If we look at the cycle of disaster risk reduction, you'll see that throughout the cycle of risk reduction, you are doing assessment. Assessment is often what we do to identify the hazard or the vulnerability or the capacity. Some people call it a participatory vulnerability capacity assessment, or PVCA. Some people call it HVCA, like hazard vulnerability capacity assessment. But in many ways, it is an assessment that identifies specific aspects to the risk that is pertaining to the population. And we involve people because they are the ones who know best about what is going on in the areas. We use participatory action, or we use PRA. We use some methodology of getting people to share their ideas. We identify what we have to be doing. We take action, we implement, we evaluate, and then we reassess, and away we go again. So it's not much different to a program cycle. There are other components, but again, I'm giving you a very simple version here, as I say, trying to accommodate all the different organizations that you guys are coming from. Now, let's think about adaptation to climate change. I'm not so much saying climate change adaptation. It is similar, but it's easier to think about how do we adapt to climate change. Often we use climate change adaptation very generally, very liberally, but I'd like you to think about adaptive processes, or how do we adapt to the changing climates? And this is, again, looking at doing risk reduction. It's about reducing the vulnerability to the potential impacts or the possible impacts of climate change, the negative impacts. If, for example, there are very positive impacts of climate change. There is rain in places that has never had rain before. So this can be a very positive impact of climate change. And of course, activities should be done to try to accommodate that particular change in the context. I know in Middle East and even in Egypt, there are very good cases where the changing weather patterns and the increase of rain has actually helped to expand the ability of rural farming. But in many cases, climate change has negative impacts, and that's where we spend most of our time working. It's where it has a negative kind of consequence on the population, the people that we work with. I'm not going to read, I don't like reading slides, but I'll be just kind of using the slides as a guide to talk about where we're going. Adaptation, just like risk reduction, can involve reducing exposure, reducing sensitivity and capacity. We talk about exposure in the case of risk reduction because often exposure is a major um, aspect of vulnerability that people, like if you are many ways outdoor, are you exposed to the particular um, context or the hazard, there is a need to try to adapt to that. In some cases, people plant mangroves to protect their houses. In Bangladesh, they have floating houses, or they build a second floor in their house so that when the flood comes, they go up onto the roof. They build rafts that they store all their personal items on. They build kind of clay safes so when the floods come, their belongings stay dry. So there's many things that people do to adapt um, to the increase kind of uh, the impacts of climate. And their capacities, like for in some cases, people look at seasonal forecasts now as a way to facilitate improvement of livelihoods. There are already you see changes in the harvest times or changes in the types of crops that you can grow. So now with technology and now with the sciences, we are able to make better accurate forecasts, and those forecasts translated at the local level can really help to facilitate planning at the local levels, and people can do a lot more when they are better aware of what the science is talking about. So a lot of the work we do with climate change is about translating the high-tech science into more locally understood forecasts of those science predictions. There are two key ways to approach adaptation. One is undertaking kind of adaptation initiatives with the community, and the other one is about adapting in the development areas like agriculture and water. So when we look at kind of adaptive processes within a community, we will often just look specifically at the vulnerability of that community and how do they adapt themselves to the impact of climate change. When we look more at development aspects, we say, okay, do we encourage a change in crops, or do we encourage more diversification of farming techniques? Do we look at health aspects? You see a lot of changes in regards to like cases of malaria, cases of waterborne illness because of changing climates. People that didn't weren't susceptible to, for example, dengue or malaria at higher altitudes are now vulnerable to those particular strands of malaria and virus and dengue. And now you see an increase or kind of a quite a more serious impact on new populations or populations that were not vulnerable in the past to these types of things. I'm going to move along a bit more quickly, I think. This is an important slide for all of us. Again, it tries to make a distinction and also the similarities between climate change and DRR. What you need to remember is that DRR is very much looking at the past. It's saying what's happened in the past and what can we do now in the present to address what we understand from the past. So we look at the disasters, we look at the trends, we look at the patterns, and we say, okay, how can we take action to do something about them, right? How can we minimize the vulnerabilities to what we understand? Of course, we look ahead and we say, okay, we know that floods have happened in the past. We know they're getting more powerful. We need to do something so that the future generation will be less vulnerable. But in many ways, DRR is most concerned with the past and the present and how development can actually be incremented as a process of that. Climate change is in most ways looking at the present. Okay, so where are we now and what's the scenarios, what's the likelihood of different climate aspects, occurring and impacting in the future. So we are preparing for bigger storms. We are looking at the now, okay, what is happening right now? What's the potential of happening in the future? So when we look at climate change adaptation, we talk about adjustment, about modifying the way that we do things. When we're talking about DRR, we talk about minimizing vulnerabilities, with limiting the impact of a hazard. So there are a lot of similarities, yes, and not one of them kind of only look at these different areas. I mean, DR does look at how do we improve capacities for the future, and climate change does look at the trends of the past, but it really boils down, it says, how do we kind of adapt to the climate? How do we adjust the risks or limit the risks and look forward? And in the next two slides, you should already have printed these out. You will see an example that I've pulled together. Again, this is a mixture of different agencies thinking, but if we look at the second column, this is DRR. The third column is adaptation. The fourth column is the synergies. Where is the similarities between the two? And the first column are different aspects that we'll see in programming. For example, let's look at funding. In DR, it's often short-term. It's humanitarian funding. It's usually linked to responses. And DRR, we often get a lot of money in a response, in a disaster response, that then is programmed to look at reducing the risk. In adaptation, we're looking more at finding sustainable funding or bilateral funding that are focusing more on the impact of climate and how it relates to development. And the overlap is the adaptation funds can drive DR. So if we get money for adaptive programming, then we can use those funds to influence or to reduce or to drive initiatives that are reducing risk. And in a few slides ahead, we'll be having a few examples of what that actually is all about. Actions, let's look at actions. Concrete interventions to manage specific hazards. If we're talking about DRR, we're going to be doing specific concrete interventions that are going to deal with a hazard or multi-hazards. Most organizations nowadays are looking at multi-hazards. For example, when you have a typhoon, you also have flood and landslides. So they look at how do all of these things connect. And then you produce proposals that look at, okay, we're going to do a risk reduction program in this particular community to help reduce the impact of typhoons, floods, and landslides in that community. When we look at adaptation, we say, okay, how are we going to help these communities to change their behaviors, to change their attitudes and their actions as a way to increase their capacity or their ability to manage what we believe is going to be the impact of the future, or the impact from climate, the impact from urbanization. Adaptation is not just about climate. We also have to think about different aspects. If you look at this humanitarian agenda, which is the hazard, maybe the hazards, you look at the Paris Agreement, which is looking more at climate, you look at the urban kind of issues that are happening now. A lot of these kind of have some overlap or synergy. For example, the actions where you see where DRR is a fundamental component of adaptation. Adaptation is a component of DRR. So there are overlaps, and it will often depend on what the donor wants to support. For example, some donors want to help with projects that are focusing on climate change adaptation, and so therefore you incorporate components of DRR into that. If a donor is more sided with disaster and the humanitarian, then you will bring in some components about adaptation. So you always look for opportunity to connect the two. And I've given you a list, two slides, which are giving you some suggestions of the differences and the similarities between the two. Again, we can discuss, we can debate. There is always differences of opinions, but what I'm trying to do here is to give you a very balanced lecture or a very balanced presentation that should accommodate all of you in your different roles. But ultimately, what we are doing is looking at this probably the most important part of DRR is the vulnerability aspect. Yeah, DRR is about reducing vulnerability to disasters. DRR is I trying to identify what is the vulnerability, what is the degree of this vulnerability, how can vulnerability be affected by different scales or different magnitudes of a hazard, and what is it that we can try to do to address this vulnerability. And vulnerability could be at the human level, the social level, financial. I mean, there's many others. And again, we'll touch on that in the slides to come. Now, for you guys, where does child protection fit in? When disasters happen, it heightens the vulnerability of children in many ways. I wish I could hear from you guys. But one of the things that you'll all be doing at the end of this presentation is doing some homework and some personal assignments. And you will need to identify some of the vulnerabilities that happen to children when we're talking about DRR, and specifically how disasters impact or increase the vulnerability of children. So I'll be giving you some answers along the way. So those of you who are online should be in a better position than those of you who aren't. Child protection measures can play an important role in preventing and reducing vulnerabilities. So if we have a disaster, for example, and children are displaced, there's an earthquake, houses fall down, their parents are killed, the children are left alone, they're extremely vulnerable to trafficking, to exploitation, to abuse. I mean, you can name a whole list of things that children would be vulnerable to if there was an earthquake or a tsunami, or even if you look at the Syrian exodus, there are a huge amount of unaccompanied minors and young children that have been separated from their families. And of course, they become absolutely vulnerable to all kinds of issues. And so you see child protection becoming a very integral part of this process. For many people, or for many protection enthusiasts, they often find it difficult to relate child protection to DRR or disasters. But I can promise you that the two are absolutely connected. And if you want to suggest that child protection is not part of DRR, then let's have a debate offline at another time, because absolutely integral part. And when we do assessment of risks, we don't just look at the flood. We look at the risks to children. When, for example, a child may find it very funny when there's a flood that they can just jump out of their bedroom window and swim around in the water. But in doing so, they're not aware of some of the risks that they are at. I've already mentioned about being separated, drowning. I mean, there's many different risks associated to children when we talk about child protection. And I know protection in your context may not mean protection from drowning, but I like to think that child protection is more than just rights. It's also about, you know, them being protected from different components of harm and risk. Factors that contribute to vulnerability, and here's where a lot of your thinking can happen, is looking at the social factors, finance, politics. All of these things I've touched on very quickly, but in every community, these work differently. There's a different combination of all of these. So you cannot just define vulnerability by the natural hazard. You have to look at different elements. And it's important that you think about a community that you work in, and then you identify different types of factors that contribute to that vulnerability. And then those things you put into your assessment or your concept note to explain how you are going to address these different factors contributing to vulnerability. That is the true essence of making a good impact or a strong impact on a project that may be designed to address disasters or address vulnerabilities subject to the population facing those circumstances. Adaptation also focuses on reducing vulnerability by adapting, right? So, if, for example, if children live near a river and you teach them to swim, you are actually helping them to adapt to that situation. If children live in a forest, you can help them to adapt to the change in the environment, or even fires, for example, by helping them to understand what to do and how to adapt their lifestyle, how to adjust to the different changes that may be happening around them. Protection is no different. If you help children to adapt to a situation and you give them more capacity, or you provide them with more security, they become less vulnerable in many ways. But all of those different elements need to be a lot more clear when we design programs to address these things. So adaptive capacity is about taking advantages of the opportunities that are there and managing the negative impacts. That's how we define adaptive capacity for children or people to cope with situations. So let's think of vulnerability through this picture. It's a very crude picture. It's taken from care. I used to work in care several years ago, but it's simple enough, and I think you get the idea. Okay, another round of OKs. Everybody, okay. I'll count the OKs, and then we'll move along. We're going to go a lot more quickly now because it's a few slides, but I need to see some OKs. Everybody there? Okay, rolling. Okay, now look at the picture. Okay, one more person. We're missing one. Okay, there you are. Okay, as you examine the photo, think about the different factors that could make people living in the orange and blue houses vulnerable. All right, I mean, it's not rocket science. It's quite easy. The orange house is down by the river. The blue house is up on the hill or away from the river. All right, so the people in the orange house would be more vulnerable to certain aspects. And the people in the blue house may be less vulnerable to flooding, but they may be more vulnerable, for example, to access to clean water, or maybe they're in a dangerous on the side of a hill. They could be more vulnerable to a landslide, for example. So you just need to think about things like this. Okay. So which family do you think is at higher exposure to flood hazards? I mean, it's quite simple, right? The orange one's going to be a lot more, they have a higher exposure to flood. Okay, oh, orange house, which is near the river. Very good. Okay, you get the idea. So it's not rocket science. It's quite a simple process, and this is how you actually. So the orange house by the river, there's a man and a woman. Okay, let's focus now on the orange house. There's a man and a woman. Who is more vulnerable, the man or the woman? Anybody? Okay, both. Good. Okay, everybody's right. Everybody's right. It depends. Remember the different elements. Remember, it's good. It depends. I'm glad. So if, for example, in the context of climate change, right? Let's not go there. Let's just stop here. So it would depend, on, okay, different elements associated to the woman or the man. Maybe there's children there, maybe there's elderly. I didn't say anything whether that was an old man or a young woman. So the dimensions of gender really have to be taken into consideration. You can't just say, let's focus on the orange house because they're more vulnerable to the flood. We have to look more into the context and say, okay, what is it about that orange house that we have to be looking at? What do we need to understand in order to design or to decide what we have to be doing? Resilience is now something, it's the big word of the day. It's something that everybody's trying to do, but nobody can agree on the definition of resilience. But in the context of climate change, we're going to use this word resilience and say this is about the ability of the household or the family or the society to cope. It's their ability to return to the state it was before or even better. And some people say it's bouncing back or bouncing back better than before. All of these things could be described as resilience. Okay, these people on the sticks, they are resilient. They've obviously been fishing for many generations. They didn't like getting hit by the waves, so they now sit on these sticks and they fish. They're resilient to the elements of the sea until a big wave comes. Okay, the tree in this picture is resilient. It's obviously been there for a long time. It's been standing up to the floods and the storms. So it's been adapting. It's been bouncing back. It's been resilient to the weather. So think about resilience in the form of being able to adapt to the surroundings, just to bounce back, to have the capacity or to build mechanisms to adjust the system. And for example, in Thailand, when the floods came, they would raise the tuk-tuks so that they could still take passengers around. They adapted their equipment to still get their livelihoods and their income. So they were adapting and they were coping when other people were not able to do so. In the Philippines, the telephone company, they're very much focused on profit. So they actually set their whole system up so that their phones will still work in the floods. So they will profit from all the people that have been hit by the floods. You still have to pay for the phone call. But again, they have adapted. They've made their system work even when calamity strikes. Okay, other ways of coping is preventative labor, kind of diversifying income. So when you are designing proposals or concepts, you make suggestions or you have analyzed the different coping mechanisms of the population and you are saying, what are we going to do to help this population cope better? In some cases, they may have to move or migrate. In other cases, they may have to strengthen infrastructure. In some countries, they send some of their children overseas to work as maids as a way to get some income to support the families back home. So these are all different aspects of coping capacities. And in the context of deciding what type of DRR approach to take, there are three kinds of approaches that we take with disaster risk reduction. One is if the disaster risks are high, we take an action specifically to reduce the disaster. If the risks are medium, we look at activities that are made more resilient. If the disaster strikes risks are low, we look at kind of enhancing the resilience of the population. So we integrate risk reduction into our development programs. In the case where disaster risks are high or they have occurred, we often design what we call DRR projects. They may be education driven or they may be health driven, but normally if the risk is high, we will then design proposals and actions to respond or to address that particular disaster or risk that has occurred. In a little snapshot, you may look at it like this. If the impact of the disaster is high, and the probability of the event is high, we often look at explicit DRR programming. So we are specifically focusing on a particular impact or a particular disaster, a high probability of that to happen. For example, let's use Bangladesh again. The cyclones and floods happen every year. So then we would design a program specifically for cyclone preparedness and flood mitigation in the case of Bangladesh. If it's low impact disaster and high probability, we may still design a DR program, but we may say, well, in this case, let's integrate this DR component into a health program. So we design a health proposal and not so much a DRR proposal, if you understand what I mean. So there's different ways of focusing on DRR, and the assignment that we'll be giving to you at the end of this is to focus on an explicit DRR scenario where the impact is high and the probability is high, and therefore we're going to design a concept paper that will be specifically looking at a particular hazard and the particular high probability of that occurring. Okay, I hope you all understand that, because that is what you will be assigned to do at the end of this presentation. Moving along, we're almost there. In planning an explicit initiative, here are some pointers that I want you all to take a note of. I believe you have this presentation, so you can go back to it. But we need to prioritize the policies that exist. We need to think about the different hazards that communities are dealing with, so on and so forth. The cost effectiveness, the technical expertise, and there's different pointers here that you need to think about and you need to take into consideration when you are planning an explicit activity associated to DR. Okay, so based on your assessment, you'll do an assessment, or you'll do a study, a desktop study. You'll do some research. Oh, okay. Just to say, the task Wayne is talking about is only for the group who have been assigned as a cross-cutting team. Okay, you guys. Yeah, I'll go back to it in a minute, but we will talk about the tasks later. But it will be okay. So, for example, if we're looking at the assessment, we'll be looking at early warning systems, raising embankments, improving drainage. This is what we would do if there was a flood that was happening. All right, these are just suggestions, but you would have to, if you said to me that you were designing a concept to deal with flooding and you were going to raise an embankment, I would then be asking you to prove to me that raising embankments is the most effective use of the money or the support that I'll be providing to you, or maybe raising drainage, or maybe all of these. So we can't do everything. We may be a health organization, we may be an education organization, so we need to be more explicit about the activities that we need to be doing. So, for example, if we say early warning systems, we would need to link that to the assessment. We would need to link that to our plans. We would need to link that to our analysis. And then we would make a proposal of intervention to deal with that particular hazard that exists. And of course, we would integrate and we would highlight how children are affected within this scenario, and the elements that we need to do, or what activities do we need to do in order to ensure their rights and ensure that they are protected and that they are safe and they are less vulnerable to the specific issue that happens.